Hello, everyone. Welcome to this town hall conversation between congregational faith leaders about what wisdoms and insights we can draw in our context of the COVID-19 pandemic from experiences of other kinds of communal tragedy and anxiety. My name is Katie Givens-Keim. I'm the Director of Religion and Civic Engagement at Odyssey Impact. And Odyssey is very delighted to co-convene today's live town hall with Macedonian Ministry. Before I say just a quick 2 sentences about who Odyssey is, I'm glad to hand the mic to my co-moderator, Reverend Mark Ramsey, to introduce himself and Macedonian Ministry.
Thanks, Katie. We're really glad to be doing this together with you all today. It's an important thing. Macedonian Ministry forms cohorts of pastors in local areas across the country with a facilitator for a 3-year experience, supporting the pastor and the congregation and trying to help them together make a community impact. We are represented by 21 denominations and non-denominational churches. We've been having something like this for the last month or so, once a week, that we're calling Conversations Among Friends and Colleagues to Support Each Other. And it's great to be with Odyssey for this, so thanks.
Great. And if you're wondering who Odyssey Impact is, we are an interfaith media nonprofit, and we drive social change through innovative storytelling and media, connecting faith and secular communities. We are the producers of the film series Healing the Healers, which provides faith leaders and educators with actually resources much like what's happening today. It's intimate conversations between colleagues about how it really is in the midst of the most challenging spiritual care issues. Our panelists today are Reverend Matt Krebin, Reverend Dr. Storm Swain, and the Reverend Dr. Tyshawn Gardner. And between them, they are pastors who have provided leadership and spiritual care in the wake of a range of communal traumas: mass gun tragedy, natural disaster, and 9/11. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Matt and Storm and Tyshawn, thank you for being here. And I'm wondering if each of you could maybe just begin by sharing with us and with one another your insights from your particular previous experiences of communal trauma and how they've equipped you for what we're living through right now.
I'm continue to be the one of the pastors at Newtown Congregational Church in Newtown, Connecticut, where we had the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School over 7 years ago. So I've continued to minister in the midst of this community that's been impacted by a disaster. I'm not sure if that, I would love to tell you I know everything I need to know for this current challenge, but I don't think that's true. But I certainly have had a number of experiences that I think are applicable about how communities that have been affected by a disaster, both right away and then in the ongoing years afterwards. So that's my experience.
Storm?
Hi, I'm Storm Swain. I teach at United Lutheran Seminary, but my introduction to working with disasters goes back to 9/11, and I'm captured by a couple of moments. One of them is working in the Family Assistance Centre and then in the morgue, and how that shaped me just in terms of how I think about disaster. But also, I was at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and we woke up to another Tuesday morning in 2001, and our church was on fire. And it was another beautiful Tuesday morning like it had been on September 11th. So one of the things that comes for me is just how disasters are often layered on top of each other, and that gives us both the privilege of seeing how we've coped before, but also how we need to take care of our own stuff to be there for our people.
Thanks. Tyshawn?
Yes, my name is Tyshawn Gardner. I'm the pastor of Plum Grove Baptist Church in the city of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My first experience of pastoring and leading through a community of faith through a traumatic experience dates back to Katrina in 2005. And even though that was in New Orleans, Louisiana, we had a myriad of people from Louisiana and Houston to migrate to Tuscaloosa. And that was an opportunity for us to walk through that with them. However, the most notable experience for me was Wednesday, April 27, 2011, when a EF4 tornado ripped through the city of Tuscaloosa, leaving 64 dead, many in communities not far from where we worship. For us, for me, it's a time for us to reflect upon and come face to face with our mortality, our finitude, our frailty, our vulnerabilities, and to help people navigate that through faith and the Word of God.
Thank you. And let me just ask sort of the opposite question. What doesn't feel applicable? What from your experience does not feel applicable to what's happening right now, the disaster that's unfolding for all of us in the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think for me, one of the things that was helpful was somebody that talked to me and said, you know, depending on where, of course, we're working this disaster, if you're working with those that are on the front lines, you're in a crisis management mode and not in an ongoing pastoral care mode. This isn't the time for those cathartic conversations of how are you feeling. This is a time of staying alongside others and being present and in some ways stepping back rather than stepping forward. And so for me, what is helpful is just simple models that enable me to be where I am and do what I'm doing. And what's not helpful is all the complex stuff that can get in the way of that. I always look for some really simple ways to be present so I can still myself enough to get out of the way and be with the person that I'm alongside. And I think that serves for community as well, to remember that it's not about us, it's about how do we be present to community, how do we be calm enough to be able to connect and collaborate with others, but also step up at those times and take a role of holding an anxious system and an anxious community in a way that's helpful rather than becomes part of a potentially traumatic experience.
For me, what's not applicable from previous traumatic experiences and disasters is that this is ongoing. So to piggyback off of what Dr. Swain just said, you have to be ready to be in this for the long haul. That's different. You know, a tornado comes in, and as traumatic and devastating as it is, the next day it's gone. You're left to pick up the pieces, of course. But for this, there's a certain uncertainty that lingers from day to day. And that, for me, is what's not applicable. So there's no script for this. There's no seminary class that teaches you how to pastor and lead through a pandemic. And so those things are quite different.
Yeah, I would highlight both in pretty similar comments. In some ways, for me, this feels like slow motion. You know, and I think that's one of the reasons why some folks may not realize it's a disaster, because in some ways it feels different than, because a disaster so often is this fast motion thing. It's a hurricane that strikes. It was, you know, the school shooting that happened, and suddenly your community is in shock, and it feels really, you know, you're just having to instantaneously respond. And this is kind of a slow motion unfolding, but it's exponential. You know, I mean, it feels like, oh, it's not much, and then suddenly there's more and more, and it has that feel of it. And then the second thing is really, this is so counter to my experience in disasters, which is after the experience of disaster, what do you do? One of the things you do is you rally people together, and you come together in community, face to face, right? And, you know, I mean, we're face to face, but we're on TV screens, you know? And so, I mean, that's just a really different, you know, kind of just a practical, functional thing that's different for me as a pastor. I mean, I always think, you know, pastoral ministry so often, from my long experience and even in disasters, was I was with people, you know, I was gathering people together. I was doing a problem solving, but it was, in the same room. And so there's just a really different feel to that. That's, a whole other challenge.
Thanks to all of you. What's the most surprising thing to you all, either in your current settings or in the experiences you've had? What took you by surprise?
What I'm hearing from colleagues all over the country is that spending your days on Zoom is really, really exhausting. We think, because we're not having to go in or go somewhere or work with the community in a different way, that it's going to be so much easier. And I think in some ways, being sheltering in place, for many are finding it, that's really complicated, and it's really hard, and it's really tiring. And for many, it's really exhausting, particularly if they are struggling with their own health, if they've got people that are dependent upon them, kids, and particularly for those with special needs kids. We can't compartmentalize in this disaster, I think, the way we could in other disasters. And I think that's both a gift and a curse, that we can be there for family, but there are, I think, multiple competing demands that come all at once. And we all think we're great at multitasking, but what I'm hearing from colleagues around the country is that it feels like I'm not doing anything well, rather than I'm doing everything or one thing well enough. So I think the surprising thing is the sense of exhaustion that goes with this lifestyle that we're living at the moment.
Yeah, I would just say for me, what's kind of different is I felt there was a big push-pull last time. I have a family, I have a wife and 4 children. Several of my children are grown in college and one's working. So we kind of thought we would never be together, kind of all together for more than 2 days. And all my kids have come back, and we're all in the same house. And, before, when I was dealing with disaster, so much of my time was felt like a push-pull with, me out and not necessarily with my family. And now suddenly my family's around and we're all trying to do other things, but it's also kind of this unfolding it feels very surreal that you're in the midst of this disaster. And as a pastor, I'm kind of push-pulled, you're always push-pulled, I think, for me at least. That was one of the challenges in our previous disasters. How do you maintain and nourish those intimate relationships that are so important? And here you have that, but you also have people, in their own way. Your family's definitely, it's clear, going through their own grief and trauma around not having, all the kinds of things that they were looking forward to this spring and even into the summer. So, that's, I think, for me, there's that kind of weird push-pull that my family's around, and yet how do I, really nourish those relationships? And then also, how am I just dealing with everything else that's, as Storm articulated, that you would think for me, this would be like the ideal position for me. I'm a natural introvert, on different scales, and like being able to be like home ministering, online. You think, wow, this is like, I was set up for this, but it really still is really a challenge for me.
I think for me, what's probably most surprising is that some of the theology that we dispense on Sunday or on Wednesdays on a day-to-day, it can be helpful, but I've learned to navigate and orchestrate that with caution. So debates and conversations about the sovereignty of God, the foreknowledge of God, can be, if not handled responsibly, more hurtful than helpful. Also, the almost immediate need for an incarnational type of ministry, of being with people that normally you may have some detached sense of relationships with. So it's the everyday walking with, living with, talking with, encouraging people even if we have to do that from a distance or through virtual means. But it's the constant walking through people with not only the effects of COVID-19, but those existing challenges that we see from day to day. And I may add this, there's a paradox, I think, also that's surprising, where there's a unity within the body of Christ and an apparent division at the same time. So of course the unity is that we are all going through this together, trying to help one another. But then on one hand, everyone is doing it different, and sometimes you can get a lot of criticisms by that. And so there's also that reality of division as well that exists. But it's beautiful to see us continue to make progress, and I think meaningful progress in spite of that.
Thanks, Tyshawn. You lifted up a couple of things. One, that paradox of unity and division, and then also theological models that just aren't helpful for us right now. I'm just wondering, Matt and Storm, whether theological models or ways of making meaning that are helpful and generative, or others that just really are not.
Yeah, I mean, what I try to tell people is that really during a disaster time, I think the focus for pastoral ministry and for your community is generally focusing less upon meaning making and more upon purpose, giving people a purpose and a sense of purpose. At least my experience with disasters is that it's really hard for people to get their heads around these big meta, arguments about God and everything else, especially people that are most affected by disasters, the people that are in the midst of it. They're cognitively, they're not able to do that, and it's usually unhelpful. And most of us know that. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I've ministered to families, even before ministering in a disaster, and I ministered to families in the midst of a funeral, and I thought I said all kinds of great stuff in the midst of funeral, and people, a year later will say, "Oh, you were so great in that funeral. I can't remember anything you said, but you were there," and so, and so I think instinctively most of us probably know that people don't really remember what we think maybe are great theological, structures that help people and somehow, place this all in context. But what I tell people is, from my experience is, if you can think of the best theology you have about human suffering and try and sit down and tell that to somebody that lost their 6-year-old child, in a school shooting in an elementary school. And guess what? It's just not going to be sufficient, And so we sometimes imagine that somehow we're supposed to be the meaning makers in our community, that we have to give the reasons for things. And people really want you to hold them. You're held by a tradition, by scripture, by everything, liturgy and all other kinds of things, depending on our traditions. And those are important, but to try and think that we're going to give people meaning when really people are hungry for purpose. How can I make a difference in what's going on? How do I help people respond, in whatever way I can, even if it's folks that you feel like have, limited ability, especially now physically, they're, it's hard for us many to get out. There's some folks in many of our churches who can't, who are, have immune compromised, situations, and aren't going to be able to do certain things, and yet still want to find purpose. How can I make a difference? So I think it's really important to help people to focus on those things, because I think what you do is then really give people, ironically, meaning, because they're finding that way, and then you can have conversations.
I think for me, I sometimes talk about good theology, bad theology, and functional theology. Does it really work in the face of a disaster or not? And for me, a theological perspective has to do with what I can hold on to, what spiritually resources to me to be present in the ways that Matt was talking about. And I remember my first shift at the disaster mortuary after 9/11, and I seem to somehow always go in for a night shift. But being there in the street with these tents and the refrigerated trucks and the disaster mortuary team and the cops and the corrections officers that were staffing the morgue. And I remember thinking, I don't know how to do this. And it wasn't that I didn't know how to be present and I didn't know, have that sense of purpose that I think Matt was talking about. And I've since learned, you know, a really good mnemonic for what we're called to do. It's the Salvation Army model of PCAID: presence, connect, assess, intervene, develop a plan of care, which I think is really helpful to frame for us what we're doing. But it was like, I don't know how to think about this. I don't know how to make sense of this myself. And what I came back to and continually found myself coming back to was just the model of God from my tradition. And I come back to the model that Jim Cotter, who's a devotional writer, talks about. God is earth maker, pain bearer, life giver. And I think that was helpful to me in terms of how do I create space for others in the face of very different contexts in a disaster. How do I just simply bear the pain of hearing the stories of what's going on? And how do I discover what's life-giving in the midst of that? And down at the morgue, there were things that I couldn't have predicted that were called on from me. And I think this disaster is going to teach us a whole lot of new things about what it is to minister over a long term of impact that has different waves all around the country. There's not one disaster curve here, there's multiple ones. But I think for me, what I learned was what was called out of me as a disaster spiritual care worker, rather than a social worker or a psychologist or some other volunteer, was to hear the stories of what was the worst part of it for the those that were working on the front lines, those staff. And I think in the hospitals, chaplains are often hearing and holding that on behalf of the staff that are working in ways that they hadn't anticipated, where you have one mask for your whole shift and not for every procedure, where you are connecting with others through layers physically, where physical and emotional resources are being called out of you in a way that you hadn't anticipated. So for me, those model of the holding space, the suffering space, and the transforming space was something that held me together, and in a way that I could then walk alongside others.
I'm wondering, and going along with what you all have just said, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about your experience about maintaining resiliency in the middle of it. All of you have implicitly or explicitly said this is a drain, it's a pull. I think we all experience that now, but also as you lived through your experience before. What did you learn about maintaining resiliency?
For me, that's been one of the blessings in this. I pastor predominantly African-American community in a marginalized section of Tuscaloosa. And it is amazing to see the resilience of people who are constantly, day in and day out, as the mystic Howard Thurman say, constantly with their backs against the wall. And so we speak of underlying issues. This COVID-19 is especially hard on people with underlying health conditions. But then for communities of color, there are underlying crises, perpetual poverty, a lack of health care, lack of access to quality health care. So there is a calling for us to be constantly encouraging, but also to be encouraged by those communities. And that's where I think resilience plays a part for me. The challenge, I think, is to measure or to reevaluate our orthopraxy and orthodoxy, to ensure that, or to re-examine rather, if what we have been preaching, if we're really walking in that, or if we're really practicing that. So it is a time to reevaluate as well for the church. But in terms of resiliency, drawing strength from the community, pastors, this is a time, I think, where pastors have to be transparent. We don't have the answers. We are afraid. We are uncertain. And it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I am concerned as well. That's perfectly fine. But from a tradition of people that have constantly faced down death and opposition, maybe none so much like this in this way, but I'm finding the resilience of the community especially encouraging in this time.
Yeah, I would just say early advice that I got right in the midst of the early days when we had the event here in Newtown from somebody that was a really important voice for me was, you think it's going to get better and you think you're going to have time and you can put stuff off, in terms of your self-care, and that time never comes. So if you keep thinking things are going to be better in a week or a month or even a year for you as a pastor in the midst of a disaster, generally that's not the case. I mean, I hope I'm not bearing really bad news for people, but I'm already hearing some pastors, on different lines that I have, people are like, hey, we're planning, when do you think how are you going to open up the church and do this and that, and, kind of already thinking maybe things are going to be better. And, but that's not even on the level of what happens with the church, the level of you personally in terms of having time for self-care. It's not going to, more than likely, what I describe it as is it's the altar of the good. In a disaster, there's this altar of the good. There's always more good that can be done. There's always more ministry that you can accomplish that needs to be accomplished. And it's really important. I mean, it is like imperative that it gets done. It feels like that. And so you can always have more that you want to do. And unfortunately, that means that very often you sacrifice yourself on that altar. And so what I tell pastors all the time is it's really important to, and I don't know what self-care looks like for different, I can't tell people, you need to go and meditate for, a half hour 3 times a day. That may work for some people, it may not. I'm not going to tell people what you should do for self-care, but what I am telling you is if you think you're going to have time for self-care in the future and you put off that self-care, that future's time's never going to come. And so you really have to practice self-care however you can do it. And whatever that really nourishes you and renews you, you need to set that time. Time is precious. In a disaster, time gets eaten up. This time gets, like Storm was saying, we're all at home. We're just sitting around. There must be all kinds of time. Time gets eaten up like crazy. So that would be my thing. My resilience, I think one of the reasons I'm still here is I heard somebody early on, just a day from the shooting here, say, you got to figure out ways that and give yourself permission to take care of yourself. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm still pastoring in this community now.
That's huge. Several folks are asking for a follow-up on this question of meaning and purpose. And I think actually this is a common thread between previous town halls that Odyssey has been doing and then Macedonia Ministry too. In our last town hall, somebody uplifted that this pandemic theologically feels like a war for which we are not prepared. That was sort of a metaphor that was helpful for one person. And in one of Macedonian Ministries convenings they've recently had, I know Tom Long lifted up that for him, it makes most sense to think about this as a time when we are in exile, like that we are in exile. And I wonder, in terms of just thinking about this time without rushing to make meaning for folks, but as you think about what this is as a person of faith, are there other metaphors like that feel helpful to any of you?
Yeah, I have a totally unspiritual metaphor for this.
Bring it.
Then I'll go to the more religious one. But for those of you trying to work out where I come from, I'm a Kiwi. This is a New Zealand accent. I am not Australian. But the metaphor for me comes from seeing a series of earthquakes in a city in New Zealand that weren't just the peak of the earthquakes, there were huge amounts of aftershocks in between them. And it feels like this disaster is like living in an earthquake, because we are so out of control in relation to this. And I think a lot of what we're doing is trying to be in control. And certainly I think our healthcare community is doing it extraordinarily well in horrific circumstances quite often. But we are living with a level of hyper arousal around this. And, you know, I've moved from a really large city to a really small town. So it's different here, but it feels like the anxiety and the arousal is in the air. So that's been a helpful metaphor for me, that sense of, you know, where is the wave coming next and when will it hit us and not. And from the Christian tradition, Holy Saturday has often been a really powerful metaphor for me about what it is to be on the other side of trauma, but there's no, you know, don't jump to Easter Sunday too quickly. But I found in this disaster that Holy Saturday space doesn't quite fit for me in the same way as it used to. Although I think Shelley Rambo's work on it, what it is to witness in the midst of this, is incredibly powerful. So I've been meditating, and maybe it's just because we've just come through Holy Week, but what is it the time on Maundy Thursday where the disciples scatter and Jesus is on his way to death, but we don't know what's going to happen. It's those kind of intertestamental spaces, almost the silences in the text, that I think we are living into this moment, where the scattering rather than the coming together, as Matt said, or the dialogue that happens out of scene. We know so many people are dying, but most of us aren't on the front lines with them, though I think many of you are. So what is it to hold those spaces in mind when we're not physically present to them? And I think for me that comes back to, how do we spiritually locate when we are socially distancing?
That's helpful. Either the other, you want to follow up?
I think for me, purpose means being together. I'm reminded in John 11, where Jesus is sent for because Lazarus has died, and Mary and Martha are in mourning and bereavement. And Jesus makes a statement basically saying, come on, we must go with them. Thomas also chimes in to say, let us go. And I think confronting death, as Dr. Swain said, death is constantly around us. So confronting death with those people who are not only dying, but also facing death in an indirect way. Confronting death in the communities that constantly see death even before COVID-19. So for me, this is a season or time or era that I think the Lord is calling us back to the purpose of togetherness, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say, life together, and particularly confronting death together. That is, as one writer would say, everyone's truth. That's everyone's truth. And so I don't think anyone should have to die or face death alone. And so the purpose for me and us at Plum Grove, it is to be there confronting death with one another and the community in which we serve.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add a little bit. From my perspective, I think, you know, there's this practice I come from a Christian perspective, obviously. And so one of the things that I think is underrated as a gift to our tradition is lament. and that's what I'm saying, because I think so often meaning is like, let's jump, like, as Storm was saying, let's jump to Easter, in fact, I don't know about other people's traditions. My tradition, people, would be perfectly happy to go from Palm Sunday to Easter and, like cut out the middle of Holy Week because, when bad stuff happens, and we know bad stuff happens, but then let's just get to Easter. And I think that's kind of like, from what I can tell, it's kind of American cultural, and that's where I say it's just such a dissonance in this time that we have practices of lament. It's okay. It's faithful. It's actually deeply faithful to say this totally, and I'm not going to say what I want to say because it's on TV, but it's okay to say that, and to be in a community and to say, we're going to lament for a while. We're going to lament the loss here, not just loss of life, but loss of livelihood and loss of, broken, social and economic structures. And, but we can lament all that before we also, because I don't know about you, but my box is filled with people already telling me how we're going to solve all of these challenges. And I think a faithful response first is to say, man, we got to just, grief is real. And I think that's one of the things I learned in a disaster, that it's okay to hold people in the midst of grief and not telling them it's going to be okay. It's going to be, you're being there, your presence affirms that it's going to be, that you're with them, as Taishan was saying, that's the affirmation, but trying to give them the words that just say, that's what, for me, that's what meaning so often is we're trying to do this. And I've seen this in other disaster moments where people just days after, in the midst still of people's grief, are kind of saying, let me tell you what all this means. And I mean, for me, that just having gone through a disaster, that pales. And so many people I know that are experiencing disaster, it just feels like you're not grasping what I'm in. And so that's where I'm trying to get people to say, but people are saying, give me a purpose. It's the reason we have, funerals, families say, what do we have to do? People are looking for things to actually help them on their journey, for sure. And that's where purpose comes in, but not necessarily trying to say, we're going to tie this all up in a nice bow and give you meaning. It's not to say I don't believe there's a meaning, and so for me, then great narratives, I think we are in I think this is a prolonged Lent, we haven't had Easter. And some people are saying, we're going to wait until we get church together and have Easter. And I think even then we're going to have church. It's not going to look the same. It's probably not going to be Easter. So, we shouldn't just hold and think we're going to, again, solve it up and tie it in a nice bow. I think it's going to be this prolonged journey. And that's, unfortunately, that's the prolonged journey of disaster, even a fast one, is that it's a long haul. It's not a short one.
Yeah. And you're all right. Just in your last couple things you've all said, you're going toward this, which we're getting questions about. What right now are you paying attention to? Because I think all of us have a choice what to go toward, what to pay attention to, and what to say, no, that'll lead me down, a place that I don't want to go or won't be life-giving. What's being helpful to you right now to pay attention to?
For me, paying attention to as relates to the congregation is trying to keep people focused on their faith and not giving up. We mentioned exile, and we all know that there were those false prophets that were telling the people that, hey, this is going to be over soon, and you're going back home in 2-3 years. But here's Jeremiah said, no, you're going to be here for a while, so go ahead and plant vineyards and dig wells, build houses. So making sure people are staying connected as much as we can by through the innovation of technology, whether that's devotions, over the phone, praying with people, expanding the platform in which we offer worship services. So focusing on our faith and being practitioners of spiritual disciplines in which we can exercise right now to help us with the resilience that you spoke of a few minutes ago.
I would say, what I tell people is the biggest thing for me is the body leads the mind. You got to find ways to if you want to regulate and help your people to regulate during this time of high stress. From what we know about trauma, it's actually very applicable as well. It seems like the brain also responds the same way in terms of stress and anxiety, long-term stress and anxiety. And that's that you really need the body to help regulate the mind. And so giving people, helping people to, and giving people permission to say it's okay to, you know, find ways, even if you're in your, you know, house and you can't get out for a variety of reasons, you know, how can we find ways to get our bodies helping to regulate. You know, I was like dealing with a really hard day, and my wife said, "Hey, we have a whole bunch of weeds out there. We got to go weed." And I go, "I'm going to go weed." And I went out and weeded. I mean, it was a gift to me that I have a house, let's face it, that has weeds. And I went out and I weeded for 45 minutes, and I felt so much better than anything I could have done, anything else. It got me out of my brain. And, you know, these are the kind of things, you know, the body pulling, I was sweating, you know, you're breathing, you know, this is really important. And people don't understand this. I think one of the challenges, at least in a lot of my communities, is everybody thinks we're all faith by cognitiveness. You know, we think our faith. And the ancient practitioners of all our faiths knew that we actually practice our faith through how we breathe, how we pray, how we use our bodies. This is not this, you know, this dissonant mind-body separation. They're interconnected. And so for me, it's really important for people to know in this time, how are you helping your people to, and for me, personally, it's helpful, but also for my congregation, how are we trying to help people, reminding people it's okay to, you know, find ways to help your body, help your mind to reduce its stress and anxieties. And we know that from trauma studies, we know that this is, you know, much more of an important way than anything else we can do cognitively.
Yeah, likewise for me, I find I'm going back to really going towards really simple practices. You know, I'm a professor and we deal in words all the time. And I think there's times when symbols and silence can carry things. So what's been helpful for me is to look at some embodied practices of breathing, like Matt was talking about. Even the simple breathe in through your nose for a count of 3 and out through your mouth for a count of 4. That one extra breath helping to regulate your parasympathetic nervous system. And I've been doing that kind of spiritually with friends that have been struggling with breath. So from a distance, we've been breathing together, which has helped us feel connected. So going towards simple practices, what it is to simply light a candle and see that. I wanted to say, though, that I was scrolling through the chat, which you can't see that well because I haven't got my glasses on, but a number of you that are working in chaplaincies, this metaphor of, you know, the pandemic, like being in a war, being drafted onto the front lines, or feel like as a second or third responder, like you can't be there in the ways that you were before. And we know in terms of resiliency, that sense of agency is one of the things that I think mitigates against trauma. But I think my guess is the greater risk in this disaster is burnout rather than trauma. Although for those of you that are seeing death after death after death, that you may be struggling with both of those. So looking for ways to increase the sense of agency and adaptability. I mean, how do we be present with people when we can't be physically present with them in the same way? And I know so many of you are ministering over cell phones or through iPads or through the door. And, you know, in my tradition, Jesus can walk through walls, blessings can go through the glass in the door as well. So a sense of agency and blessing and community, even in different ways. So I just know for those of you on the front lines, we are really, the fact that you are there and somewhat isolated and cut off from others, but our spiritual selves are right there alongside you and standing in whatever communion of saints we may be, holding you up when you feel like you're about to drop.
Katie, I think also what we've not talked about a lot is our families, especially those of us with children. I have children and grandchildren, and it can be very difficult for adolescents, teenagers, children to make sense of what's happening, especially with their energy. They want to go, and so you're constantly saying no or don't ask again, you know. And so one of the things my boys and I are doing is every night reading through the Psalms. So we rotate readings and then prayer. That helps every now and then, and I don't make it a requirement, but you know, I try to take that time to minister to them through the word. But sometimes it's just the reading of those Psalms of lament, reading those Psalms of victory and triumph, and witnessing through the Psalms humanity's hurt as it is expressed through David and other writers. So for people with children, we really have to be aware and proactive and intentional about gauging their mindset. They may not just come out and ask the questions, but just constantly checking on them, I think, is very needful during this unprecedented time.
Yeah, and that word about children and just attending to families makes me think about, you know, where we're finding joy. And in the midst of, you know, for those of us with children, we're homeschooling as well as doing everything else. And where are y'all finding joy right now?
I hope that pause is not an indication that there is no joy. I think joy, you know, there's so much that we can find joy in, even in the midst of this. I've already mentioned the joy of seeing the body of Christ come together. You know, as a pastor, my son-in-law assists me as a youth pastor and associate. We are constantly on the phone gauging needs, and it's been very seldom that we've had a parishioner to voice their needs over those of wanting to help. So we're finding joy when we're calling to encourage. Our parishioners are calling us or saying, "Hey, Pastor, how can I help? What can we do? Is everyone all right?" So there's joy in that. There's joy also in walking in the nature. The heavens and the earth declare the glory of God. So even in the midst of death, we walk outside to take a brisk walk, and God's presence is there in the trees, in the cool breeze, in nature, in life, other people walking, even if it's at a distance. So that's what joy is for me.
I always, just after Sandy Hook, the shooting at Sandy Hook School, the Sunday after that shooting was actually Sunday in Advent, and it was traditionally called the Joy Sunday, where you light the joy candle. And so, as you might imagine, we in the church, you know, had to kind of say, how are we going to light the joy candle? But part of our conversation even before that in our congregation had been the fact that joy and happiness are two different things. So happiness is, you know, comes from the same root as happenstance and, you know, circumstance. Basically, you know, it's dependent upon what's happening around you. So joy for me is that deeper sense of, especially as a faith tradition, of what is, you know, what is it that grounds us in that? And I mean, you already heard, you know, some of that in terms of was just mentioned, but I would just highlight, I think, you know, for me, and maybe it's because my community has gone through a disaster. There's a lot of laughter here. You know, sometimes people say to me, Newtown, Connecticut, oh, how are things in Newtown? It must be, you know, and it's not that there's not grief and, as I mentioned, lament and all these other things, but we laugh, you know, there's joy because we understand the depth of care and connection that we have. And so I think then, you know, I mean, every day, you know, when I'm trying to figure out how to talk on Zoom, you know, that's like what the heck am I doing? And there's legitimate joy there, like, because I understand the human imperfections and the challenges. And so you can laugh at that at the same time you're saying, how do I do this effectively? It's not the one or the other. And I think that's the kind of thing that, for me, joy holds all that there is together, and finds that you can still have this deep and abiding sense that, yeah, you are beloved. And one of the things I tell pastors in the midst of disaster is, one of the things that I hope everybody that's watching this now knows, that you are loved, you are beloved. From my tradition and my sense of who God is, you are loved by God, passionately. You are beloved. Know that no matter what else is going on, no matter how sucky the week went, if worship, got frozen and you didn't get on Zoom, whatever it was that happened, just know that you are still beloved. And I'm the same thing as Taishan. When I call my community, I have so much joy, because, it's like I call these little, some of what we call, quote unquote, the shut-ins, the people that, they're probably really in trouble. They're, and they're like, you talk to them, how can I help? What can I do? Like, I'm fine. Do you need anybody to shop for you? No, we've worked this all out with, my neighbors and some of the church members. And it's like, I didn't even, as a pastor, have anything to do with it. And yet that was happening. And for me, that's joy when I see, people doing that and responding, and kind of living out of this sense, again, of purpose, where people are saying, how can I, do this? That for me, there's just this powerful sense that joy is there. And for me, joy doesn't pretend that the sorrow and suffering isn't there. I think that's one of the challenges, is so often we think, I can't be happy. Well, no, I don't think anybody should be happy, but I think we can all be joyful. Personally, that's my sense.
I think I agree with you and disagree with you at the same time, Matt, because for me, I'm taking pleasure in a lot of things, but in the midst of this, I'm not experiencing a lot of joy, particularly as I have people that I feel like I'm constantly praying for. And in our small community, our chaplaincy team here, we're waiting for the surge to come. And I'm taking a lot of pleasure in walking my dog, and like a few of you on chat, I have a beach close by, I can do that. But I have a friend who's been really sick with the virus, and she's had waves of better and worse and better and worse, and we're hoping that she's on the better and that will keep going now. And she said something like, but don't express your joy too quickly, just in case we might go down again. And it's like, oh no, I want to fully give myself over to the joy that she is doing better today. And if I go down to the pit again, that's where I go. But I think part of this pandemic for me is there's few moments of actual joy that break in. And that's okay. And I think one of the things that I find challenging of this, and with 9/11, when we were engaged in chaplaincy, we were asked this really facetious question before we were deployed, and it was said, one of the questions was, with the American Red Cross, have you been affected by the disaster in any way? And we all knew we were supposed to say no. What they needed to be asking was, have you been personally impacted with the potential loss of somebody in your close family or familial group? Because we were all affected by the disaster. And likewise, we are by this disaster. But for many of you, and for all of us in some ways, but for many of you, you are living with a level of risk to your own life and health that you haven't been on a normative level. And so I think finding those places where we can take pleasure in stuff, technical word stuff, whether it's the comfort food for me, which is, the West Wing or Monty Python or some other self-medication that helps me take a 5-minute break from what's going on. Finding good ways to care for ourselves in the midst of this, and ways to care for ourselves where joy can break in, but ways to care for ourselves that don't just feel like another burden of what we have to do, but actually help us connect to those that are holding us in a wider level, or just places where we don't have to care for others, that we can, you know, whether it's just going into the bathroom and closing the door and having 3 seconds of no demand, or watching your kids when they're asleep, or you know, that line in the psalm that just keeps going over and over for you. Finding those spiritual touchstones, those physical touchstones, to balance out the way we are called to bear pain in the midst of this.
I think there's also a joy that's found in serving as well. We have a mobile drive-by food drive coming up, and just the mere joy, there's joy in thinking about how many families we're going to help and bring relief. But we've done some small things, small acts of kindness, and there's joy in service. There's joy in serving. There's joy in seeing that there's a difference. I serve as the vice president for student affairs for a small liberal arts college here in Tuscaloosa. And one of the things I think we during this pandemic, you know, when it first hit, most colleges and universities across the country made the decision to go fully online. And I think they did so with that assumption that everyone had a computer, that everyone had access to Wi-Fi. But when you are at a college where probably 50% of the kids don't have hardware, don't have computers, or they live in areas where there is no Wi-Fi, it helps you have to process those actions different. And so we were left to grapple with that. So we have kids at our school that honestly, they are better at school than they are at home. Now, of course, we're not having any in-person classes, but the joy of ministering to them, the joy of seeing that they will be able to continue their studies by way of purchasing Chromebooks, or being able to find a grant that can help them with some portable form of Wi-Fi. There's a joy in that. So there's a joy in the labor, the sweat, the tears of knowing that you're making a difference for someone who would really be in a bad place if we were not doing what we're doing.
Oh, that was so thoughtful. Thank you so much. We have so many more questions we could ask, but we want to honor the time, but thank you. And what a great place to end. And with your reflection on that, and also all the chat contributions reflecting on that too, truly remarkable. Katie?
Yep, we are so glad I'm at Odyssey to partner with Macedonian Ministry, and happy to, I know both organizations are just happy to keep these conversations going in different ways. So we thank you so much for your time, and thank you to each of our panelists who came with wisdom and vulnerability, honesty, and just insights that really can stick with us. So thanks to everybody, and until we see each other again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.